Hello everyone, my name is Gabby and I am joined today by a very special guest. Would you like to introduce yourself for everyone who's unfamiliar?
My name is Jeffrey Doty and I'm an author.
I'm here to interview him to talk about one of his books that I read recently, Odd Tales. So you've had many careers in your life. You're a barber, you are an author, you've done journalism, you've done photography. So what inspired you to begin writing?
My mother was an award-winning journalist. She taught me to read when I was like 3 years old, and I've never known a time in my life when I haven't been able to read. I think she said the first thing that I started writing was around age 5. I got into haikus, Japanese haikus, and so I started writing those then, and my first attempts at like science fiction and adventure and stuff started at about age 7. By age 13, I was writing for a Star Trek fan magazine. Yeah, I got to meet Leonard Nimoy, Mr. Spock.
Oh wow, that's really cool.
I've been writing my whole life. A lot of newsletters, a lot of articles for magazines and small newspaper things, but nothing really serious until I got into my 30s and I had my kids. And then I started writing seriously with the idea that I would write for them, things that would be published for my children.
So your books are independently published, which is obviously very different than working with a publishing company. So do you want to talk about what that process was like?
I had a friend who was a writer who became an indie author, and I didn't want to do that. I wanted to go the traditional way. I knew that my writing was good, my tools were good, if you will, but I just couldn't seem to click with anything. And then finally he says to me one day, he says, "Jeff, I've seen your work, it's very good, you could do very well. Why don't you indie publish? It's so accessible now. We have things like Kindle, which allows indie publishing. We have Create Space, which is that's also connected to Amazon, and so you can publish that way very simply. But the important thing is you have to still put out a professional product. I had to hire an editor. I mean, I work as an editor as well, but I had to hire another editor because it's kind of like they say lawyers can't defend themselves, right, or they have a fool for a client. Same thing I say about editors. Editors can't edit themselves, and a lot of that is because in your head you have the story complete. You may not realize you're missing bits and pieces of it that a fresh set of eyes will.
Right. Obviously, because you have experience independently publishing, you've released 6 or 7 novels, you said, independently published?
I've published 6. My 7th is on its way.
So what tips do you have for anyone who wants to independently publish, like certain advice that you would give now that you have become skilled in that area?
Well, one of the things that I think the biggest mistake people do is the very first thing they write, they want to independently publish it. That is pretty much doomed to failure. And the reason why is because writing is a skill set. You want to do the writing clubs, you want to join an organization. Like when I got into writing for children, I actually became a member of the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators. And they didn't have a group that met in my area, so I started the first chapter in my area, which is still going today. You really do need to hone your skills, have fresh sets of eyes to look at it, learn where your weaknesses are, learn where your strengths are. But I would say the most important thing is until your short stories are being accepted regularly by magazines, you shouldn't indie publish because you're not good enough.
So specifically talking about Odd Tales, which I'm here to interview you for today, it contains a wide variety of stories, each which is very different from the rest. Was there one that you particularly enjoyed writing over the others, and if so, why?
I would have to say that my absolute favorite was Across Two Beaches. Across Two Beaches is kind of almost a sci-fi type of thing. The story in Across Two Beaches is about a young man, Private Tony Marletti, who is part of the D-Day invasion. As he's coming ashore and all this chaos is going around and there's all this fear and terror, he stumbles into the water, and when he comes up 40 years later on a beach in Florida, and there's a young woman there. It takes place, I think that beach is on Sanibel Island, if I remember right, and the reason I chose that beach was because we used to vacation there fairly often, so I know it. He finds he's traveled in time, but as things happen, he keeps getting pulled back to 1944 and then ahead to 1974. He comes to realize that he has to pick a point at which he leaves this little bubble of time, which beach he's going to stay on. And that's a huge choice. What actually inspired me to do it was the movie Saving Private Ryan.
Wow, yeah.
You know, and I saw that, and I happened to have a customer named Tony who was in the war back then, not at D-Day, but he was in World War II. And so I took Tony Marletti's way of speaking from my customer, Tony.
That's really cool. So that was one of the things that I was going to ask you next, because each of these stories are so unique. If there was certain inspiration that you used, whether it be like movies or TV shows or history or even people that you've met, and how you sort of incorporate that into your writing, because obviously you want to be able to create stories that are your own rather than, just directly taking from other sources.
Yeah, I like the guitar. I wrote that one because at the time I was learning to play the guitar. And I really got an appreciation for how good, in particular, the Spanish guitar players can be. I mean, their fingers just fly, and it's such an intense form of guitar playing. I admired their skill set, and I thought, how cool would it be if you could sort of inherit that skill set? And so I wrote a story about a haunted guitar, if you will. The ghost of the grandfather is passed on into the boy, and when the song is over, he goes. And I thought that was fun. Also, part of that was that the guitar was in a junk shop. I've known some people that have junk shops, and they're always kind of friendly, quirky people. And so that's why I wrote the guy that ran the junk shop that way. One about the dog, I think it's called Beneath the Trees. That was my dog Clyde. I wrote that about his passing. The one with the cemetery, that was an experiment of mine. I was trying to think about how it would be possible to humanize something we fear, such as ghosts. That's what that one is about, is, make them kids. They just want to play and they're waiting to go home. And that's what it was all about.
I thought that one was particularly beautiful. I really liked it. It just had like a certain writing to a certain style to it where you just read it and it was just very mesmerizing.
Much of my writing with stories, with the various different stories, is me doing exactly that, playing with styles. First story of mine that ever got published was one called Kefchen and the Forest Troll. And I was trying to mimic the style, if you will, of a Russian folktale.
Well, sort of going off of inspiration, another big part of writing is research. Is there a certain method that you have for when you're doing research for a novel, and what research do you do particularly?
It depends on the novel. If we're just talking fiction, usually you have to understand your setting. That's a big thing that a lot of people don't really think about. But if you're writing a setting, you have to be able to describe why it's the way it is, and it may depend on what you're trying to do. To write a good fantasy novel, which generally tends to be in medieval culture or in that castle lifestyle type thing or servant lifestyle, you really have to understand what life was like back then in order to make it believable.
Right.
Because unlike reality, fiction has to be believable. There's a lot of unbelievable stuff that really happens, but if you try and do that in a book, people are going to hate it, because in a book there has to be cause and effect. And so that's where your research has to go in, is into the little details that will make it believable.
So talking about just writing in general, do you have a particular environment you like to be in when you're writing, like food or drinks you like to have, or any playlists you listen to if you listen to music while you're writing?
I actually try not to listen to music too much. If I'm going to listen to music, it's not going to have people singing. It will be pure instrumental. Doesn't have to be quiet, or it doesn't have to be full-on rock either. Just not annoying. My environment at home, I have a little office where I do voiceovers and I do my writing, and everything is kind of, my wife calls it my dungeon, and I just have a desk there. I also will write here at the shop, sitting in a chair, and I use a stool as my desk with my laptop on it. So I can write pretty much anywhere, and as long as it's just some way of writing. I have another young adult novel called Aviera. I finished that sitting in the lounge area of a cigar shop here in town, writing it on they don't have them anymore, the little Palm Pilot.
Oh, wow.
I'm good just about anywhere. I know people that are particular about being quiet and silent and certain amounts of lighting. One of the funniest things that I ever saw is I went to a writer's conference months, and they asked us all to bring photos of where we usually work. And some of the conditions that some people wrote under were just absolutely, to me, hilarious. There was a woman that wrote it at her kitchen island. Surrounded around her were all the little things that she constantly have for her kids. Baggies of Cheerios for the babies and stuff like that. Couldn't write standing up there.
It just depends on the person, and for you, just getting the words down.
Yeah, and for me, it's more about location, or not location, it's more about being left alone to do it. And it doesn't have to be for long, because if I've got a 10-minute break, I'll write for 10 minutes.
Right.
If I've got an hour break, I write for an hour.
Right. So I guess sort of going into time and writing too, obviously sometimes published authors have to deal with deadlines. And as an indie author, is that something that you have to deal with as well, or is it sort of your own self-imposed deadlines?
Usually it's my own self-imposed. Rare cases, now that I have some nonfiction out, when you're dealing with people, they have expectations. They took part in the story, and you've interviewed them, and a lot of them want to go immediately from interview to published book. You have expectations that kind of mount up on you. I'm working on a true crime novel right now, and I've got a group of people and some fans from my last true crime novel that they write me constantly wanting to know when the next one was out, and it was going to be out, and I thought it would be out by Christmas. But this is going back to the research. We keep getting more information, and I keep getting more interviews. I just did one in my car today, talk about location. So as you get more interviews, that takes more and more time and sets the deadline back and back.
Yeah, okay, that's really interesting, because obviously I know sometimes published authors can have deadlines pushed back just because, they want to be able to have the best possible product that they feel is best for them. Is that sort of the same thing with you? Is that you just sort of...
That's the most important reason for me about indie publishing is I won't put out something I'm not proud of.
Right.
And because of that, if there is a conflict between my self-imposed deadline and what I have coming in, I'm not going to be in a rush to get it out. I want it done right.
And I mean, that should be something that you would hope that any artist, that they know sort of.
Yeah, that's why I think the whole indie movement, film, music, writing, art, everything, because of the computer age that we live in now, the internet, it has made the ability to distribute what you have done so much easier. I think that's a boon for everybody, not just the people doing the writing, not just the people putting out the music, but you get to hear more than you would if you were only relying on the traditional outlets.
Right. Obviously, you have a lot of experience as a writer. Do you think that there's any particular memories or things that stand out to you that are particularly prominent that you've had in your experience of being an author? Like any fans that you've met who've had really cool interactions with you?
The very coolest thing is, for a couple of my books, I've had people write in the reviews that my book made them cry.
Oh, wow.
And to me, that's, that means you made the connection.
Right.
You always try and connect with the reader. You're always trying to make them understand, because that's what writing is all about. It's about communicating. And more than just words, it's about communicating information. Most importantly, it's about touching someone's heart.
Right.
That's all I want to do.
Yeah. And then the last question that I have for you, you're also a journalist and you do a lot of journalistic work. So what do you think is the major difference between writing for a novel versus a journalistic piece? And then is there one that comes easier to you?
I love fiction for one reason, and that's because there is no expectations. It's just me and the words and the invisible people that are running around in my head.
Right.
And when you're doing journalism, the kind of journalism that I like to do is I'm going after the truth. I want to present the facts, and I hope that it will have an impact in somebody's life, but I don't want to influence them one way or another too much.
Right.
I mean, there are certainly, you want to guide people to have an eye-opening experience, but the type of journalism that I do is just, it's all about integrity and honesty.
Okay, so is there one particularly that comes easier to you when you're writing? Like particularly, do you find it easier maybe to write out a novel than you do writing a journalistic piece, or one that takes
Fiction
more
is
time?
easier.
Okay.
As I said, there's no pressure, there's no outside pressure, there's not a group of people that are sitting there, when's it going to be out? You don't have anyone that's going to be happy or disappointed. I'll give you an example. In my book Piggyback, I had two friends, and it was the reason why I got interested in the story that I wrote about this. It took place in Sycamore, Illinois. And in 1957, a little girl was kidnapped and murdered, a 7-year-old girl. And in 2012, they wrongfully convicted a man by the name of Jack McCullough for it. And when I went into doing this story, I had two friends. One was a prosecutor and one was a public defender that were on opposite sides of that trial.
Oh, wow.
I just was going to record it as a historical thing because it was touted as the oldest cold case in U.S. history ever to go to trial successfully. And when I got into it, I thought that Jack was guilty. I had bought the story that had been put out by the prosecution, and as time went by and I did my research, as you asked about, I finally got a hold of the FBI files from the original investigation, and in there was plenty of evidence that Jack could not possibly have done it.
Oh, wow.
And so when I wrote this book, I lost a friend. I was friends with the assistant state's attorney in the case. I said basically that the prosecution railroaded him, and that was it. I lost a friend. So while on the one hand, that was such a horrible thing for me to go through, but because I told the truth, Jack has told me on a number of occasions it saved his life in prison, because I presented the timeline that showed exactly why he couldn't have been involved. He was placing a collect phone call from Rockford, Illinois at 6:57, and the kidnapping took place between 6:45 and 6:55. There's no way you can get from Sycamore to Rockford in 17 minutes.
Yeah, that's really amazing. And do you think that was worth it to you, if it meant losing that friend, to be able to publish a story that you thought was genuine?
The truth is always first and foremost, most important. If you aren't going to be truthful, then nothing you write can be of value. I mean, even if we're writing fiction, we write about truths.
Right.
So in nonfiction, you have to hold the same line. You have to write about truth, and that's worth it at any cost.
Right.
It's painful, but it's worth it.
So thank you so much for being here on
Oh,
my
you're
channel
very
today. To sort of wrap this up, would you like to plug yourself and talk about maybe any upcoming projects you have, or talk about your social media, where people can find you online?
Well, you can find me on Facebook under Jeffrey Dean Doty. I'm also on Twitter, I think, as at Jeffrey Dean Doty. My upcoming project is called A Convenient Man. It's the full story, because after his conviction was overturned, there was a lot of information came out. And this is a book about the full story about how Jack McCullough was convicted wrongfully. A book for young adults that I'd really like people to read, and it's my favorite, and it's one of the ones that people have said have cried. They've cried reading it, is Aviera. And it's a fantasy book about a rebellion in a world of birds. So if you like Brian Jacques, you'll like Aviera.
Wow, that's really good. So thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time with a new video. Goodbye!
Broadway, here I come.